Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to the LaRouche PAC Strategic Overview for Monday, April 3rd. I want to start off before I turn it over to my colleague, Mike Steger, with a couple of remarks and just a few updates for people to think about as we begin this discussion tonight. First of all, I think many of you know that we are at a pivotal turning point in the fight for the soul of our nation, that as we gather here tonight, President Trump, who just left his home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, has now gone to New York, to Manhattan, and he's at the Trump Tower, where he's going to be going tomorrow to the Manhattan courthouse, where he will be facing the the acting Supreme Court Justice of Manhattan, Judge Marchant. And as people may know, this is a part of the ongoing attacks and witch hunt, as President Trump has said, not just on him, but on the American people. And if anyone is still on the fence or questioning the role that they play in this fight to save our nation, it's not just the fight of Trump, but as he said, he is standing between you and the globalists and the deep state imperial apparatus, as we call them, that's out to destroy our country. Now, I want to share that today, most people may not have noticed this, but as the president was going to face the criminal, rotten bureaucracy of the injustice system, that on today, at the very same time he was flying off to New York, this same president, or excuse me, at the very same time that this was happening, a very important development happened in the NASA space program with the Artemis mission, which is very relevant. Today, the NASA announced the selection of 4 astronauts that will be flying around the moon in 2024 with the Artemis II mission. And this mission comes upon the developments that have happened with the uncrewed Artemis I mission that took place, that finished its 25.5-day mission, test mission on December 11th, 2022. Now, for those who forgot, President Trump many times talked about greatness and making America great again, and talked about what we need to return Americans to greatness by establishing a foothold on the moon and Mars through the Artemis mission. He signed Space Policy Directive 1 in December of 2017. And since that time, he put the course on the path toward greatness through his programs and his vision for the space program, for the Artemis mission being the first one in 50 years to call for sending human beings back to the moon for long-term presence and exploration and on to Mars. And it's atrocious to think about the fact that the very president who's talked about quantum leaps for our nation, talked about making America a manufacturing superpower, talked about the idea of what is greatness, is now continuing to face the witch hunt by the operations of the imperial British deep state and globalist operations that he has fought from day one. So we'll be waiting to see what President Trump has to say tomorrow as he returns from after the court arrangement. Once he returns back to Mar-a-Lago, there's a scheduled 8:15 meeting where he will be addressing a primetime live event or speaking to the nation. And we'll see what's going to happen with that, because as many people know, at the same time, there has been warnings of a potential or possible gag order against President Trump. So we have a fight on our hands. But in order for us to address that fight, I wanted to share, I think, what someone brought up, and I saw a report questioning whether President Trump would be arrested or would face criminal charges on the day of face criminal charges on Easter. And one thing that came to mind is, the question about that is many different thoughts, but I wanted to take from the standpoint of something that Lyndon LaRouche had always been discussing from the standpoint of this idea of the Garden of Gethsemane and one's bearing of the cross. And Lyndon LaRouche understood this. And I bring this up because at the time where we face so much fear, so much question as to the direction of the nation, what's happening, can we actually stand these continuous attacks from the witch hunts, the Mueller operations, the Russia, the fact that we are in a potential deadly war situation right now. And in the opening of a statement that LaRouche once wrote called "In the Garden of Gethsemane," he quotes from Matthew 13:57. And it says, "A prophet is not without honor save in his own country." And you think about that, it goes to this idea that every single one of us, like Christ on the cross, has our own cross to bear. And I think that it's a question that all of us are facing at this moment of time. And I believe that LaRouche understood that question, and Lyndon LaRouche, as well as President Trump, as he faces this great evil apparatus that is not only going after him, but going after our nation. And so this is what I think is important in Michael's statement that he just put out, and in the statement that he put forth in addressing this call tonight, the message that we sent out, as he says, President Trump has said that they are not coming after him, they're coming after us, and he just stands in the way. But the truth, this is true, but while Trump was a beloved billionaire icon prior to running for office, the American people have been under assault since no later than the day that World War II was won. The globalists had to turn America into a geopolitical tool rather than resuming the role as force against the empire. And so this is a question. The American people have to once again become the force against the empire. And in order to do that, leadership is required. And that's what Trump is representing. That's what Lyndon LaRouche represent. And that's what the movement is that we're building around the MAGA movement, around the America First movement, and the movement to redefine greatness in this nation again. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael with that, but I think that is something for everyone to think about as we are in the greatest fight for the soul of our nation with this outrageous criminal, what LaRouche called rotten bureaucracy in charge of our country that has to be brought down now. So Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Keisha. As Keisha said, it's probably the greatest fight for our nation in its history. It's really even a fight for civilization itself. There are some valiant efforts being made by other countries to operate independent of this globalist kind of tyranny. But to secure that, you really need to secure what is the domain of European civilization, and the critical component of that is the United States. That's just undeniable. However much the EU wants to pretend it's some major player, it's a collapsing, attempt to regain the past. So we are facing a great crisis. And as I said in the email, and Keisha just read it, Trump very often says, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you. I just stand in their way. And that's certainly true. And it's certainly how he's able to compel a continued support for him from the population, that they realize he could, and he certainly could, end all of this persecution if he decided not to run for president. It would just go away. But there's a different question that's posed by the current circumstances. There is nothing legally they can do to prevent him from running for the president of the United States. They could even put him in prison, and he can still be a legitimate, viable candidate for president. They will more than likely tomorrow attempt to put a gag order on him where he can't talk about the case for upwards of maybe 10 months, depending on when the trial occurs. Whether Trump abides by that, and I suspect he just wouldn't, and they would fight that as a separate legal battle of his First Amendment rights. It's a similar tactic they used against Roger Stone, as you may remember. But the real question is that they cannot prevent him from running for president. The Constitution is very clear on in Article 2 on the executive branch. What qualifies you, your age, and that you were born here in the United States. There's not much else. You don't have to be without a criminal record, because the founding fathers knew that it's not a question of what some system of injustice, like the British Crown at that time, might have said or done to you that should disqualify you. And they had the foresight to recognize it's not about what any justice system in this country ultimately says about someone. That it's up to the population to decide who they want to lead it, that's a sovereign characteristic. And so the same goes with the nature of an election. And of course, we ran up against that, in 2020 when they ran what we call N3, but all of the mail-in ballots and all the other corruption and censorship and everything else. It's our Constitution realizes that this executive power is a challenging question, because we're handing over essentially the powers of the king, except for going to war, and certainly at some degree the power of the purse. But there's extensive power in this position, and we're going to leave it into the hands of the population. And as our Constitution itself says, we, the people of the United States, that in essence, it is not a constitutional assembly which has written something, but it is something that will be ratified and given the consent, and that ultimately who holds the power in that Constitution is the American people. Now, we're by no means a democracy. We're not a democracy. 15-year-olds can't vote. I mean, there's one example. Not every person gets a vote in this country. Whether it should be 18 is getting harder. They want to go to 16. The Democrats do. It's getting harder to justify 18-year-olds voting, given the lack of maturity in the population increasingly. But we are a republic, and there's a different conception there. And that conception comes down to a quality of leadership, that we give consent to leaders, to what we choose as our leaders. And that's something that no criminal court in New York or anywhere else can ultimately control. So in some ways, I've made a long-winded argument to simply say, we stand between them and Trump. And that's our responsibility. Because the only way to neutralize this attack, and this is why we've stressed his Agenda 47 videos and his policies, and if you haven't seen the most recent one, he makes a direct attack, not just on the neocon apparatus and the entire foreign policy establishment, but he makes a cultural reference to say, you can't go around calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal as if somehow he should be tried and hung like a Nazi. You can't degrade Russia as a nation as if it's lower than other nations of the world. And it's not simply talking about Russia. I think he would say the same about China or Venezuela or Iran or North Korea. That these nations have to be given respect. It doesn't mean that we let them do whatever they want, but they have to have the respect because the nation has to be seen as its people. And that if those people are given the respect to participate in civilization, they have a right to. That intervention, specifically in this case on Russia, is profound. That Trump has taken an approach towards this dynamic, which is not practical. He's not just a rowdy guy out there, having fun with the World Wrestling Federation or whatever else he's done in his past life. He's engaging in some of the most profound and challenging conceptions, not only for our foreign policy establishment, which he's ridiculed, but of the American people. But the threat to our enemy today is not simply Trump, it's that those of us who recognize the crisis that we're in, that this is civilization, and it's much of mankind, because the policies of globalism are to reduce most of mankind to cheap chattel labor. And to grind them up. And to allow some kind of tech elite somehow run the world in a kind of globalist fanfare of AI bots and global air travel and the internet and so on, but that the rest is basically just cheap labor policies. This is what you saw in the Soviets, the Nazis. This is what you saw in the British Empire with India. Why the American people revolted as early as 1763, when you started to see a shift in the American people's awareness that no longer were they going to have their independence from the crown or from the British imperial policies, that they were now, the target was on their back. And so if many of us, not just some, but this has to be a broad movement, then we create a different dynamic. We nullify their ability to simply threaten the elimination of Trump and somehow the problem goes away. Now, I say all of this because, this is called the Monday Strategic Overview. I would love to be able to simply give an objective description of where the situation in the world stands. Here's the situation in Ukraine, which apparently the Russians have taken Bakhmut. It now tends to be called Artemovsk, which is the Russian name. They've raised the Russian flag over City Hall. This has been the most contentious battle in the war. It's a critical juncture of the entire Ukrainian defensive position and lines that they fortified over the last 9 years. And we could discuss that. We could discuss the financial situation, where the condition of the banks are, the bank lending, the consolidation of deposits, what else is going to happen. And we could also discuss all of the profound things that Trump has put forward, the city building, which is really extraordinary. To build 10 new cities, as we discussed last week, is an extraordinary step. But there's something about, I guess you can put it this way, in it more of a joke or irony. No one told God the universe has to work according to our senses. Meaning, the universe is not by its nature empirical. Empiricism was something called part of the Scottish Enlightenment or British Enlightenment, similar to the French Enlightenment. That they decided that the whole world, that the way the universe works in its very smallest and most infinite substance is by describing what we see. It's called empiricism. Empirical, to describe what's there and to come up with laws that describe those things in the most universal way. Oftentimes people reference the inverse square law of gravitation. The problem is that no one told God that's how the universe is supposed to work. Yet our enemies, these globalists, these neoliberal Nazis, the Bragg queens, the perverse culture of the Bragg queens that we now have running our justice system, they don't understand that the universe works differently than through empiricism. They believe that power, what they think is immediate power and control to threaten, intimidate, ruin people's lives, print money, central banking, control media, control propaganda, censor, drug people up, dumb them down, numb their souls, numb their brains. They have power to do that. They can then control the population. But they don't realize there's something different. And it's why an objective description of a scientific nature or of a political and strategic nature fail. It's because there is something unique about the human soul that's actually part of the universe. The soul is not outside the universe. We just think it exists, but it really isn't here. That's what an empiricist, that's what David Hume might say, or Adam Smith might say. The soul really is, it's a nice conception, or Isaac Newton, but it doesn't really exist. But what does that mean? It means that there's a subjective potential to develop. That if all we have with our movement today is what we've had so far, you could add more numbers, but if the qualitative nature of this MAGA movement remains only what it's been thus far, we probably fail. And that doesn't even mean we don't get President Trump elected. Maybe we still get President Trump elected. But President Trump getting elected does not in and of itself secure Western civilization. Now, I say this to you entirely devoted in my entire course of existence to making sure President Trump is elected. I don't want to minimize it or diminish it at all. But it's only one critical giant step, as was winning the Civil War, as was winning the Revolutionary War. But the fight, the political fight, didn't stop once we won the Revolutionary War, nor once we consolidated a federal constitution or eliminated slavery and won the Civil War. The political fight continues, but more importantly, ensuring that President Trump gets elected also requires the enhancement of that subjective potential. It's how great tragedy is avoided. Now, we had a class on Saturday night. It's not yet been posted, by Robert Ingraham. But in that class, he discusses the principle of classical tragedy, a very, very kind of subject near and dear to the heart of Lyndon LaRouche. Because how do we understand the collapse of civilizations, the collapse of entire nations? How do we view the collapse of Europe into the condition it is today, where it's voluntarily given up its sovereignty as nations? Or what happened in Nazi Germany? What happened in the Soviet and Bolshevik Revolution? What happened in Japan? What happened in China's Mao? What happened in the United States over the last 50 years? We've gutted our industry. We've drugged our population. We've made pornography common fare constantly. Even all the major cities of our country have already or are now planning to replace whatever is left of industry or whatever's left of corporations wanting to even center themselves in a Chicago or New York or Los Angeles proper, because many of these corporations are just leaving. They want to bring in gambling casinos. You want to turn every city into a kind of gangster slum. That's a formal policy we're increasingly adopting in our country. We've been so gutted and destroyed. How do you understand what's happened to the United States over these last 50 years if it's not been a sense of classical tragedy? That this was in essence what was studied by these great poets and playwrights and thinkers, was what happens in the minds and characters of the population. And to a large extent, this is, as most know, if our education got anything done, Hamlet's great soliloquy, the to be or not to be. Read it. Read what he is challenged by there, and ask yourself if that's not what many people today in our country are facing. I don't mean hardcore MAGA supporters. I'm saying many people who, like Jason Whitlock, who was on Tucker Carlson on Friday night after the indictment came out, and said, I've never voted. I never voted for Trump. I've never voted. Right now, he says, I am hardcore MAGA. Now, Whitlock has made the shift. He's made a complete commitment. But there are many people who are still wondering, is this really that bad? Is it really time for me to have to do something different than just going along, accepting things, going along with the crowd? Or do I now have to make a decision of a different nature? Well, the ability for that to occur is really about the human soul, to make that leap, to make that qualitative change. But for those of us who are already made that political commitment, the process doesn't stop there. We wish it did. It would be simpler if the universe was just black or white, good and evil. But that soul, that quality of soul continues as a dominating strategic factor. It's why the three things they've attempted to eliminate since Immanuel Kant, another one of these empiricists, said the three things that we basically have to eliminate are God, free will, and the human soul. Doesn't say it in such an aggressive form, but ultimately the outcome of his writings, of his work, of his influence are that: God, free will, and the human soul, or the immortal soul. We see this quality of courage in Trump, but tragedies are not avoided simply because there is a good hero. Tragedies are avoided because the population's response to that quality of leadership is to raise its own standard, its own intellectual quality. Because God didn't know he was supposed to be an empiricist, but he does know he gave us a mind to use, to develop, to always come to deeper and deeper understanding and higher qualities of assessment of a situation, and that any problem we face can be solved through collaboration, discovery, and insight. That today, at the point where, as many people have described it, it is a crossing of the Rubicon. It's a reference, of course, to Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon River with his army, and which basically ended the Roman Republic, or it was symbolic of a republic ending. But the republic didn't end because Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The republic ended, and if it ever really functionally was a republic is another question. But for metaphorical purposes, because the population was just not of the quality of a classical Greek republic. It never was. It always functioned as a military power, outright, not as an intellectual center. That the question for us today is similar. That on the eve of the indictment of Trump, a leading presidential candidate and likely the attempt to gag him. So he's unable to discuss because they don't want this to be held in the court of public opinion. But what are they looking to disrupt, as we all know? Is that, are we up to the challenge? And that doesn't mean, are you emotionally committed? Are you willing to martyr yourself? Are you willing to take the figurative bullet on behalf of this political fight? Because many of us have that sense of emotion or devotion to what this cause represents in so many different layers. But are we willing to continue to deepen our sense of understanding? You know, Keisha referenced the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, the nature of that garden, as many of you know, was that Christ had come back into Jerusalem, known as Palm Sunday, and basically it was a Seder, it was a Passover dinner, the Last Supper. Afterwards, they go out into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's going to pray and contemplate, because he's confronting that he knows he came back into the city, they're going to kill him. Or they're certainly going to arrest him and likely kill him. That's what he's confronting. The disciples, fully committed and devoted, fall asleep. Peter denies that he knows Christ. This question of the passion, which was something that inspired profound music, like Bach's St. Matthew's and St. John's Passion. If you haven't listened to those, do so. But it's not a question simply of devotion. It's an intellectual sense. What is the mission that this country has that Trump himself has come to understand? He understands that we are on a mission as a nation and as a civilization. And our responsibility today is to capture that same sense of mission in our own way, through our own intense levels of work and dialogue and commitment. That's why his city building proposal for 10 freedom cities, and maybe we have more questions on it tonight, is such a powerful question, because we have to revive a sense of the civilization we're building. We have to make that a living demonstration for the 30-year-olds and 20-year-olds and 10-year-olds that are in our country and in our world. It has to come back as a powerful and forceful demonstration of what building a civilization, building a 21st century, building a future looks like. That's why we find it such a powerful proposal. But it's for each of us to grasp this, because what stands between them and Trump is us. If Trump's willing to put himself there, and I think that's undeniable. And if you look at his recent videos, even for those who think Trump's foreign policy and Mike Pompeo and who are the others, Rex Tillerson and all the foreign policy people he brought in, they were so awful in so many ways, and basically undermined much of Trump's own policies. You listen to the clarity of what he's saying today. He's qualitatively shifted. He's making it more transparent and more clear than perhaps any presidential candidate in history. Perhaps not since Lincoln, at least, if that even is comparable. But the crisis we're in is greater. The crisis and destruction of our civilization. When we confronted our civil war, Western civilization was not about to be entirely destroyed. After decades, maybe a century of destruction, yes, they had imposed cheap slave labor on the New World. That was an imposition we had to throw off. We had to free the population and incorporate all people into a sense of a standard sense of what humanity represented. But Western civilization was on an ascending point. But by the turn of the 20th century, this process starts to erode. The culture starts to erode. And since the end of World War II, when the United States became the dominant political force on the planet, they looked to hijack and destroy every element of us, the police state, the intelligence community, the war complex, our education, our drugs, our music. And what we have to turn around with Trump's election, what electing Trump has to represent is a turning point to fundamentally change that decline. And we have to do it rapidly. Because what comes after Trump is going to be determined by what we're able to accomplish in that course. And securing Trump's presidency, to put it once again, just in short summary, depends on our ability to grasp this now. And to make it so that even their attacks on Trump, even if they could eliminate Trump from running for office, the movement would prevail perhaps even more profoundly. And that's, I think, the task in front of us tonight. It's a dramatic moment. I have the greatest confidence in Trump's courage. I also recognize that, and I think many of you do, that there are the theory of unintended consequences. The potential for this to blow back on our enemy is incredibly high. But I chose not to emphasize that because no one needs it's going to be fine, boys discussion. That's not what we get on these calls. We come together because we know that if we're going to really pull this off, given the stakes and consequences of this fight, then somehow we have to find a way of contributing more, not quantitatively more time, more money, more text, more emails, but qualitatively more. We have to become that kind of person that can become as much of a threat to their system as Trump has today. Maybe we don't have the billions of dollars and media attention for decades as Trump had achieved, but that same quality of kind of brilliance and strategic conviction to really challenge this system so effectively. Because certainly they're not going after him because he's rude or brash or mean tweets or any of that nature. They're going after him because he has effectively been able to threaten their system. And it's up to us to make sure that he and we do fulfill that effective threat. So that to me, that's the most important aspect of the strategic dynamic tonight, is what we do and what we take out into this dynamic. It should be what every church in our country is actually discussing as a spiritual and strategic factor, because it's by very nature where politics, religion, the human soul intersect. But that is the very essence and bedrock of Western civilization. It's Socrates and Plato. It is the Christian movement out of the Judaic culture into a direct intervention and challenging of Rome's satanic insanity. It is the Renaissance and the building of an advanced scientific and artistic culture. It is the development of the sovereignty of nations based on the sovereign mind and creative powers of the individual. And that really is what's at stake tonight. That's what this campaign and movement are going to become, because it has to. But to fulfill that will require us as individuals to participate in a self-conscious way. So I think that probably covers what I wanted to say. So Keisha, I guess I'll give it back to you, and we'll open it up and see what other people are thinking. I think there's a lot to discuss, and I'm sure people have a lot to report on.